Okay, so we're recording now. Okay, like I said, this is the second part of the Buddhism series. Probably the last part. We'll see how far I get on this one. We're going to talk about what happens as Buddhism spreads east through China, and then south through modern day Thailand, Cambodia. Eventually, it gets all the way over to America. We probably won't have much time to talk about that, but we're going to talk about all the different schools of Buddhism that develop. It sort of splits off after the death of the Buddha. Apparently he sent his disciples off to teach the Dharma. Remember, the Dharma is his teaching, the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. And in your textbook, they mention King Ashoka. He is usually given credit for spreading Buddhism outside of India. He lived about 200 years after the historical Buddha, and he becomes a Buddhist apparently after this long war. He conquers all these territories through a very violent campaign that involves all this destruction, and apparently he felt deep remorse for all the things he had done, and he turns to Buddhism. So under his leadership, Buddhism leaves India. And many people say that if it weren't for this guy, if it weren't for this king, then Buddhism might not have survived. It really isn't a vibrant force in India, in current day India. It's much more prevalent in other countries, Sri Lanka, Thailand, parts of China, not so much anymore, but definitely Japan and the Asian Peninsula. So, again, I think I mentioned this in the Hindu lectures and even in the Jainist lectures. There was a big, I don't want to say big, but there was competition amongst these faiths that were rising up around the 5th century between Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism. And it looks like Hinduism really won out, this sort of nationalistic version of Hinduism. So, just want to emphasize that Buddhism is not very common in India today. And the Muslim invasions didn't help much, right? When the Muslims invade India, they destroy a lot of the temples. And it's really, Buddhism never really has recovered since that time. But anyway, so once it spreads, as I said, there's all these different schools of interpretation. This is a scan I got from the textbook. So obviously you have the founder, Gautama Buddha, the historical Buddha, the Shakyamuni Buddha. And notice the first split, really, there's two major branches, okay? So here on the left, you've got the Theravada school, the school of the elders. And then you have the Mahayana school, the great vehicle. I can't remember. There's another name for Theravada, and maybe it's good that I can't remember it because it's considered sort of offensive. But some Mahayana practitioners, they refer to Theravada as the small vehicle or the lesser vehicle, and so that's seen as sort of derogatory. But the idea is that the Mahayana is the great vehicle. More people are open to salvation. More people are open to enlightenment, whereas Theravada is only the elders, only the special practitioners, only those who are the chosen few are able to achieve enlightenment. Others have to wait maybe another reincarnation or two before they're able to manifest as a being that can be set free of that cycle of samsara. So again, the two major schools are the Theravada and the Mahayana, and then under the Mahayana, you've got all these other, probably the more well-known school here in the West is Zen, although it's not as widely practiced as some of these other schools. So oddly enough, I guess Zen is just more popular in the West. But there's the Shan, which is the Chinese version of Zen. When it, by the time it gets to Japan, it develops into the Zen school. Vajrayana, this is the Tibetan Buddhism. There's also Pure Land and the Jodo Shinshu. These are both Japanese, and Pure Land is more of a Chinese strain, but they're both very much based on the notion of a bodhisattva, which we'll get to later in this lecture. Shingon, I don't know too much about Shingon, so I guess I shouldn't comment too much on it. I think it's a little, it's very similar to the Pure Land. And then the Nichiren and Soka Gaikai. These are also both sort of Japanese variants. Nichiren we'll talk about a little bit in this lecture, not too much. Again, I don't know a whole lot about it. Let me back up a bit before we get to the actual Pali Canon. So both schools, right, they both are in general agreement about the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, all these teachings about karma, samsara, nirvana. So all the stuff that was on the last video, all the stuff that was on the last lecture, all these schools pretty much agree in these beliefs. They might approach them differently, but they all believe in these notions. So Theravada, School of the Elders, also known as the Path of Mindfulness. They study the very early scriptures of the Buddha. They're often referred to as the Pali Canon, or the Tripitaka, the three baskets. So the Theravada, they honor a life of renunciation. So it's all about living in the monastic life. The highest goal is to become a Buddhist monk, but of course you're born into this. The idea is that you're born into it. You're born a Buddha. You're born, ready to be enlightened. So it's a big focus on meditation. Ordinary lay people, the ordinary followers, are just kind of there to support the monks, and the monks sort of, I guess you could say that they provide a service to the community, good karma to the community. And so if you feed the monks or you visit temple and seek spiritual advice from them, that's sort of good for you, and you might be reborn as one of them in your next life. There's a little bit more on this if you want to hear more about like the Theravada school in the Footsteps of the Buddha, the documentary that I posted on D2L. It's pretty old documentary, but they focus on the Theravada school in the sort of one of the oldest schools that we know of in Sri Lanka, modern day Sri Lanka. Of course, the documentary's from the 1970s, so it's not exactly super contemporary, but that in that country, Buddhism is still, I want to say it's still the majority religion. There's a lot of other, there's Hindus there, there's Muslims, but I want to say that as far as I know, Sri Lanka is the only Theravada majority country. So again, a little bit more about the Buddhist canon. The word canon, I don't know, this might be the first time we've seen it in our textbook. Canon, which is the single N, C-A-N-O-N. It means an authoritative collection. So there's a Christian canon, there might be a difference between a Protestant and a Catholic Bible, some of the books that are canonical and non-canonical. So it gets complicated. But in the Theravada canon, this is the Tripitaka, okay? And the Mahayana canon, they add even more books. So the three baskets. So look how huge this is. Look at all the different books you have. So you have, one of the basket is the Sutta. Those are the discourses. The Vinaya are, I used to know all this stuff. It's been so long, so I'm getting really rusty. I know the Sutta are the discourses, but the Vinaya and the Abhidharma, I'm not really sure. I think the Abhidharma are just like the philosophical or abstract teachings, and the Vinaya might be tales or stories. This might be where like the Jataka, but please don't take my word for this. Again, it's been so long since I've studied all of this stuff. But in general, right, these are the sacred writings, the three baskets. These are the three collections of sacred writings, believed to be collected by Ananda. Remember, he was the Buddha's disciple that was apparently there and remembered all the discourses and passed them on orally. So according to Buddhist lore, this whole canon was compiled by a council of 500 elders who had studied directly with the Buddha. Of course, remember Ananda, I mentioned him already. He recited all of these discourses from memory, or he was able to. So the suttas, again, those are the ones I'm most familiar with. Those are the ones people read the most. They're the discourses, the sort of dialogues with the Buddha. Those are thought to have been written down during the first century CE. There's also some non-canonical commentaries on all this stuff as well. So this doesn't exhaust the Theravada canon. When it comes to sort of other spiritual teachings within the Theravada. This is something that I suppose Buddhist theologians will admit started with Theravada, but it's not unique to them. So this notion of the triple gem, when you get to Mahayana, they also have this notion of the three gems of Buddhism, the triple gems. It's the Buddha himself, the enlightened one. Now, how that's interpreted, what the Buddha is or who the Buddha is, might be understood different by different schools. But that's always one of the three gems, the Buddha. I would say the Theravada for them, it's the enlightened one, the person who brought these teachings to us. The Dharma are the teachings themselves, and the Sangha, we already mentioned this in the last lecture, that would be the community. All the people that have realized truth and enlightenment and are there to support us together in our quest, in our search for spiritual enlightenment. So one teaching that I think is almost uniform amongst all forms of Buddhism, but certainly is true of Theravada, is that you don't get refuge, you don't get enlightenment by praying for help, but you do it by honoring the Buddha and using him as an inspiring model. So you try to follow his model. The life of the monk in the Theravada it's described in the textbook. I have this long quote here that I'm going to read. So this is again from our textbook. It's page I think 148. She writes that the Buddha established one of the world's first monastic orders, and the Sangha remains strong in Theravada countries. There are presently about 500,000 Theravada monks in Southeast Asia. To simplify their worldly lives and devote themselves to studying and teaching the Dharma, monks and nuns shave their heads, dress in simple robes, own only a few basic material items, eat no solid foods after noon, practice celibacy, and depend on the laity for their food, clothing, and medical supplies. Every morning, the monks set forth with an alms bowl, and the lay people regard it as a merit-making opportunity to offer food to them. The monks reciprocate by offering spiritual guidance, chanted blessings, and performing various social services, including offering advice and education. And again, this makes me think of the documentary I mentioned earlier, The Footsteps of the Buddha. The opening scene, it shows these monks walking through the countryside in Sri Lanka, and they have their bowls with them, their alms bowls, and they just stand at the gate of a person's property, and people see them and run out and just offer them food. So again, you can watch that documentary if you're interested in it. And for those of you who are watching this on YouTube and are not taking my class, it's available. You can usually, I think it's on YouTube is where I have it linked, so it's available there. So the bhikkhus or the monks themselves, they hold this revered social position. They're considered models of self-control, kindness, intelligence. And the nuns, okay, so these are the females, the bhikshunis, they actually start to decline there's a sort of I guess an upsurgence in early Buddhism, and we see a decline in them. They're kept isolated, and there's still a big debate within this school, right? Within Theravada, there's big splits on whether or not nuns can actually be enlightened, or whether they have to be reborn again as males. And again, some of the text can be interpreted in a very sexist light. And it does seem like the male monks, if you go to many monasteries, especially the Theravada ones, you'll see nuns, but the male monks seem to have all the positions of authority. They seem to hold all the spiritual power. I didn't mean to do that. So there are two basic branches of meditative practice in Theravada, the Theravada school. So meditation, you're going to see, is a big part of Buddhist practice, no matter what school you're in. Some schools, like Zen, makes it the focus. In fact, the word Zen is just short. It comes from the Chinese word Shan, which comes from the Sanskrit word. I can't remember the Sanskrit word, but they're all just mispronunciations of it, and it just means sitting meditation. So again, meditation is important and it's key. In Theravada, there are two branches, two types of meditative practice. One is samantha, which is the calm meditation. It's meditation where you're just calming the mind. And then there's vipanassa, which is an insightful meditation. It's spiritual meditation that brings about insight in towards some spiritual truth. There's another passage I want to read from the book. This is describing um, Vipassana. Okay, so again, this is the second type of meditative practice, the insightful type. You focus your attention intently on, one object perhaps. Focus on breathing, and then proceeding into this more intense, insightful Vipassana practice, where I don't know if this is a universal thing about all the insights within Vipassana, but from my understanding, they all have to do with the insight of the first noble truth, the fact that, or I guess the first and the second, that all life is suffering, and that there's a way out of the suffering. And so it's just a sort of a realization of that. But I better just sort of, let me read this passage. Maybe she does a better job of explaining it. So she says, she writes, as taught by the Burmese meditation master Mahasi Sayadaw, the way to begin Vipassana practice is simply to watch oneself breathing in and out with attention focused on the rise and fall of the abdomen. Okay, so it starts calm, right? You keep your mind concentrated on this movement rather than being distracted this way and that by unconscious, conditioned responses. One continually makes concise mental notes of what is happening, rising and falling, right? So taking note of one's breathing patterns. Inevitably, other thoughts and feelings will arise in the restless mind. As they do, one simply notes what they are, imagining, wandering, remembering, and then returns the attention to to the rising and falling of breath. Bodily sensations will appear too, and one handles them the same way, noting, itching, tight, tired, and so on. Periods of sitting meditation are alternated with periods of walking meditation, in which one notes the exact movements of the body in great detail, lifting, moving, and placing. If ecstatic states or vision arise in the process of meditation, one is told simply to note them and let them pass away without attachment. In the same way, emotions that arise are simply observed, accepted, and allowed to pass away rather than labeled as good or bad. So, I don't really know how helpful this honestly is. To me, this passage just reminds me of about everything I've ever heard about meditation. I think I mentioned this in previous videos that I used to take meditation classes, did it for quite a while, still meditate today. But when I was going to meditation class, we would do breathing. That's how we would focus on your breathing, count, very slowly as you exhale, count to 10. Try to count to 10. If you can't make it to 10, slowly work your way up to it. Don't count too fast. Don't count too slow. Eventually, don't count at all. And then again, just sort of let your mind do what it does and try to empty it. And again, alternating between this and moving, what's called walking meditation. Of course, the school I went to was Shan Buddhist. It was, a form of Chinese Zen, the meditative school, but it's very akin to what is being described here in this passage, right? So I'm not really seeing what the insight is besides just sort of the ability maybe of yourself to calm your own mind. I think a lot of people, they hear the word insight and they hear about this state of calm and tranquility and oneness, and they tend to mystify it and think of it as something otherworldly. And to me, I think maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe if you're like a Mahayana practitioner, you might think that that's the case. But I think if that's what you're looking for, you're probably gonna be disappointed. At least that's been my experience. Although I think it's great stress relief. Anyways, I digress. Let's move on. We'll talk about bodhisattvas in a minute. There's still a few things I want to say about some of the devotional practices in the Theravada school. So, there are some who turn to devotion. Obviously, not the monks. If you sit in front of a Buddha statue and give it offerings and pray towards the Buddha, that might be seen as attachment. Now, obviously, the monks are going to hold the Buddha in honor and respect, but only as a model of behavior. Okay, so some would obviously think that these kind of practices, standing in front of a statue of the Buddha or something like that, and showing reverence towards it, would be antithetical to Buddhism. In fact, there's a saying in Zen: if you run into the Buddha on the road, kill him, right? So the idea is like on your path towards enlightenment, if you run into somebody or something that you think is the Buddha, who maybe even is the Buddha, and you're so excited, kill him. Maybe not literally, but like put him out of your mind, right? You're not looking for idols, right? You're looking for a detachment from that. But nevertheless, some Theravada practitioners see devotional practice as appropriate. And I would assume, like many other faiths that we're going to look at, you look at some forms of Christianity, some forms of Islam, they're going to defend themselves against this. Like, well, we're not worshiping these images. We're not worshiping the saints. You know, if you're Catholic, you're not worshiping the saints. You're worshiping the God that made them possible. And these are just aspects of the divine or something. And in Buddhism, it's not even a God. It's just you're respecting the teachings of this noble man, and it's just sort of gratitude. It's not idolatry per se. So that's usually the sort of theological justification for it, if you will. And they even point to the fact that, you know, there's some scriptural evidence that the Buddha told his followers to honor his relics when he died. I mentioned this in the last video, that there's even sites where they honor what they think are his remains and his, his bones and stuff like that. Again, some would say that's idolatrous and antithetical. That's a form of attachment. But others, again, they'll defend that practice as just a mode of respect and honor. Okay. All right. So now we're going to get to, let's talk a little bit about the Mahayana. I'm going to say some general things about Mahayana, and then we'll get into the actual, some of those other offshoots, the sub branches within Mahayana, particularly really just Zen, the Pure Land School, Nichiren, and Tibetan Buddhism. And we aren't really even going to say a whole lot about them. There's not a lot in your textbook, and I don't know a whole lot about them either. I know more about Zen than any, and that's just because of my own personal interests in that tradition. So I might say a little bit more about Zen than I will about the other three, but like I said, this will probably be a pretty quick lecture. We're already over halfway through my notes, and let me look and see. I'm looking ahead. Yeah, I think if we get through all these different schools, I will be super happy, and we're doing great for time. But if you ever want to jump in, feel free with any questions or anything like that. All right, so let's get to the Mahayana. Again, this is the great vehicle, so it's seen as open to more people. It's not, just the monks, but maybe depending on which branch of Mahayana you're looking at, it seems as more equal opportunity Buddhism. I guess you could see it's also been referred to as the path of compassion and wisdom. So it emphasizes those two virtues, being compassionate and towards all living things, and seeking wisdom and truth. All of this is important as a part of religious experience, and the notion of liberation from suffering and helping all beings to liberate them all from suffering. This is like sort of a key aspect of all the Mahayana branches, whether we're talking about Nichiren or Zen or the Tibetan schools, Vajrayana, Pure Land. So we were talking about the Pali Canon. Okay, so let me back up on a few slides. So the Pali Canon, we've got all the Tripitaka with the 3 baskets. The Mahayana school, they honor all of these books as well. So they're going to take all of these as canonical, but they're going to add a lot more. There's even more added to the Mahayana literature. So a lot of this stuff that's in Sanskrit was translated into Chinese, into Tibetan, and then through that practice, there were poems and commentaries and other things also written in Chinese and also written in Tibetan. And, most of these are poems that praise the Buddha, praise the deeds of all the different Buddhas, and also of the Bodhisattvas. So I think Bodhisattva is a term I keep using. I think I've used it a few times before, and I still haven't explained it. So what is a Bodhisattva? Does anybody here, Stephanie or Michelle? I'm not sure that's how you say your name, sorry. Do you know what is a Bodhisattva? Did you read the textbook?
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna clarify. I'm using my brother's iPad, so my name's actually Estefania, and
Oh,
it's just
Estefania. Okay, good. So,
yeah.
I'm glad you said that. So now I know who to give the extra credit to. That would have really confused me. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So did you read do you know what about? This is actually some people have heard of it before. You know, like I know some people like they've heard of Buddhism and they know a few things about it, and this will be one of the things they know. Oh yeah,
Is it
bodhisattvas.
like a
Go ahead.
very early scripture?
What's that?
It wasn't, isn't it like something related to like a very early scripture, the Buddhist, like what you just said?
Well, there in some of these Mahayana scriptures,
Yeah.
like the Lotus Sutra, there are stories about different bodhisattvas. Okay, but the
Okay.
bodhisattvas are supposed to be these enlightened beings, so
Okay.
they have found enlightenment, but yet they have stopped short of nirvana, so they stay behind in order to lift others up. And
Oh, okay. To
yeah,
liberate others. Okay.
so you might the word the term like the Bodhi, I don't know what it means, but the Bodhi tree is where the Buddha sat. Okay, so a Bodhi tree is a type of tree. I don't know if the word Bodhi means something, but remember sattvic in yogic practice was considered. You know, if you're, we were talking about in yogic practice in Hindu, when you're
Mm.
talking about the meditative yoga, when you're trying to achieve a sattvic state, right? There's like a calm state that you're trying to achieve. Most of us are either
Mhm.
restless, our mind is restless, we're like
Oh, yeah,
constantly
it was like a
thinking.
difference. You had to, for the most part, like people usually like are always like worrying and they're stressed out. They have a lot on
Right,
their
yeah.
mind.
Either that or you're sluggish, right? You're either dull or sluggish, or you're like all anxious. And
Mm-hmm.
the like sattvic state is like this state of unity or whatever. So, I mean, I'm sure the word sattvic, probably is a Sanskrit, but a bodhisattva in Buddhism, in Mahayana Buddhism, again, it's an enlightened being, and there are many bodhisattvas. We'll talk about some of the major ones, and some of these have different names in different countries. So I'm just going to use the terminology in the textbook, but I know some of them go by different names. They're pretty much the same being, but again, they have achieved enlightenment, but stay behind to help other people achieve enlightenment. And there's this famous metaphor analogy. It's like somebody who's escaped a burning building, and they're outside the building. They're not burning, they're not suffering, but they stay behind to help others and to guide them out of the building or something like this, right? So you know
Mm-hmm.
they didn't leave, they didn't go to nirvana, to the higher plane of existence. They stick around to guide others on the spiritual path. So I mentioned the Lotus Sutra. I think there's a quote from it we're going to get to in just a minute in the textbook. But in that book, it claimed that there were, that these earlier teachings of the Buddha were very skillful means for those with lower capacity. So, in other words, um, there was this sort of reverence for the old, and so they thought that the people who lived back then were much wiser, and when Buddha was around in those times, he had these rules set out that are just too hard for your average Joe. People can't do this. So you need to look for guidance, you need to look for help from these spiritual beings. Okay, they help you in your quest for enlightenment. um, so the idea is that these teachings, these Buddhistic, the Buddhistic teachings, are presented at different levels for different understandings and for different people, according to the audience. And so that allows, I guess, that allows the Mahayana school to accept the Theravada books and to respect them, but also to add to them, to move beyond them. And so the Lotus Sutra, that's the one I keep mentioning. That's one of the most important texts, the Lotus Sutra, in the Mahayana scripture. It claims there's a higher goal than the achievement of nirvana, the arhat, right? The arhat is the person who's achieved nirvana in this lifetime. That's a Theravada term. The higher goal is to become a bodhisattva, right? This is, again, it's a being who's dedicated to liberating others from suffering. And so the Lotus Sutra says that all beings have the capacity for Buddhahood, and they're all destined to attain it eventually. So both monastics, both monks and the laymen are urged to take. So if you're a Mahayana, you have to take the basic bodhisattva vows. In fact, even when I was like going to that Buddhist temple to take meditation classes, I think after you take 2 or 3 levels and you get past intermediate, you actually have to take these bodhisattva vows, and they actually have more. There's like 12 of them at their school, but these are the 4 basic ones. So here's they're listed in the textbook, but I have them up here on the slide, so I'm just going to read them there. This isn't the, yeah, they are. This is the now they're worded differently in different schools. This is the Tiantai. He's the founder of the Tiantai school. But these are sort of the basic. Beings are infinite. I vow to save them all, right? So I have to care about everything, okay? And I have to care about all other things and have compassion for all of them. I have to vow to try to save them all. The obstructive passions are endless in number. I vow to end them all. So again, non-attachment, right? Vinyasa, that term we learned about in the first lecture. Non-attachment. The teachings for saving others are countless. I vow to learn them all. So learn all the ways you can help. Buddhahood is the supreme achievement. I vow to attain it. Okay, so focus on non-attachment. Focus on whatever it takes to achieve that level of non-attachment and get to nirvana. So those are the 4 basic bodhisattva vows. Now, I promised in the last lecture that I would explain the significance of the lotus flower, and I never did. And I'm looking at my notes here, and I don't really think there's any place for it to come up. But since we're on the topic of the Lotus Sutra and how important the Lotus Sutra is for the Mahayana, maybe I should explain why the lotus flower is such a great metaphor, such a great symbol for Buddhism. Does anybody have any idea? Do you even know what a lotus? Have you seen a lotus flower before? Either one of you? You've seen one?
Yeah.
Okay, so so where do they usually grow at? Or on?
Well, I seen them like I seen them like in cartoons and all that stuff, like movies.
Right,
but I haven't really seen it in life.
Well, you live in Houston, you can see a lot of them. If you just go out to like Bel Air and go to go out to like Chinatown, like they're all over the place. Or go to a Buddha temple, you'll certainly see probably some. And where would they be? Like in the cartoon, where are they? Where do they grow? Do they grow in the grass?
No, they like in the water.
Right.
No?
They grow in the pond. Yes.
Yeah.
So the idea is that the lotus flower is a beautiful thing when it blooms, but in order to achieve that, in order for it to get to that point, it has to work its way up from below the pond, right? Its roots go all the way down to the bottom. So it starts in the mud, in the dark, I guess, like attached to the world, and then through meditative practice, right? So I guess it's just a metaphor for us climbing out of, all these worldly attachments, the muck at the bottom of the pond, and trying to float up through to the clear surface. And then, when we achieve enlightenment, we bloom like a lotus flower, I suppose. I have this quote here from the Dalai Lama. We'll talk more about him in just a moment. He's at the end of the lecture when we get to Tibetan Buddhism, but just let me read the quote here and then we'll move on. The motivation to achieve Buddhahood in order to save all sentient beings is really a marvelous determination. That person becomes very courageous, warm-hearted, and useful in society. So again, the Mahayana path, whether we're talking about Tibetan Buddhism, the Vajrayana, the Zen, it's supposed to be this compassionate path, right? We look for wisdom and we look for compassion and to try to help others. So, so the bodhisattvas are not just some ideal of conduct. They're believed to be present and they're also available to hear petitions, especially in some other forms of Buddhism. So here's Guan Yin. If you go to in Stafford, I think it's in Stafford. It's off Sinai Road. I don't know. That might technically be Sugar Land. There's a Vietnamese Buddhist center where they have a huge statue of Guan Yin, and if you go there on the weekend at certain times, you can hear people inside the temple chanting, and some of the monks and the priests, they'll be hitting on drums, and there'll be a rhythm, and they'll just be chanting mantras, I guess, for lack of a better word. I don't know if that's what they call it in Buddhism, a mantra, but repeating the word of Guan Yin, the name of Guan Yin, giving her thanks, giving her praise. And so, the idea is that if you are devotional towards these beings, that they will help and guide you towards enlightenment. Now, again, you might be thinking, as I definitely was when I first heard about this, that this seems to be like a form of attachment and kind of antithetical to Buddhism. But again, some of the Mahayanas are going to say that the early teachings were too strict for most people, and they were only for like the ancient times. And since our world has become so corrupt and our world is so filled with distractions, that we have to look to these enlightened beings to guide us. That's the only way we're going to get out of this trap and this cycle of birth and rebirth that is samsara. So again, this is just one of the bodhisattvas. This is Guan Yin. She's it's typically a female, but sometimes takes on the man. It looks like a man. Sometimes it's a male figure, depending on what region of the world, and typically has all these hands, all these arms reaching out, helping us, guiding us, lifting us up towards enlightenment. Okay, one thing also, and there are different interpretations of this in different schools of Mahayana. Some interpretations are more supernatural, more mystical than others. Some schools take these as just more metaphorical, that these are just metaphors. They're not referring to anything supernatural. Remember the Buddha himself, I think I mentioned this in the first lecture, he didn't speak a whole lot about supernatural things, about the gods, and he actually thought that when we question things and we look for answers like that it's just another form of attachment. So that being said, take these as you will. These are the three bodies of the Buddha. Again, in the Theravada school, the Buddha was just a person. That's it. It's just a guy. It was a historical figure who showed us the path to nirvana. But again, for the Mahayana, the Buddha, it comes to be regarded as a universal principle in some sense, or even a presence, an immanent, like the Buddha. It's the Buddha soul, or it's the Buddha spirit. And so again, in the universe, there are these three aspects, our three bodies of the Buddha. And the first aspect, this is the body of enlightened wisdom. It's the formless Buddha, the Buddha without form, the emptiness that is being searched for. We'll talk more about that when we get to Zen, right? The goal of meditative practice is a sort of emptiness, letting go of one's ego and becoming whole in a certain sense. By becoming nothing, you become one with everything. The second aspect, the second body of the Buddha is the body of bliss. This is the celestial aspect. This is the one that is thought to have, this is what communicates truth, all the teachings of the Buddha, the Dharma, between all of the bodhisattvas. So all these enlightened beings transfer their wisdom to each other through this body of bliss. And then the third aspect is the body of transformation. This is believed to be the body by which the Buddha manifests himself in various forms. So again, take these as you will. Some forms of Mahayana are much more superstitious and take this stuff very literally. And then there are others that are more, you might say, less supernatural. They take this as more metaphorical and symbolic. So I mentioned this notion of emptiness, of sunyata. Nagarjuna is probably one of the most famous Buddhist philosophers besides the Buddha himself. And his teachings have been super influential to, I would say, some Westerners, more so than other Buddhist philosophers. and certainly to the Zen school and even some forms of Taoism. So when we get to Taoism, he's a pretty important figure. And a lot of the things that we know about Sunyata, this teaching of emptiness, nothingness, the goal of meditative practice, which seems like sort of a kind of a lame goal. Like, I want to be nothing. Like, why would I want to be nothing? You know, but he explains it. And many of his writings are very paradoxical. They seem contradictory. So, you know, as useful as they might be, they're definitely not easy to follow. So he talks about sunyata. There's a quote in your book I'll read here in a minute, okay? But just sort of some basics. So sunyata is, it's a void or emptiness. It's again, it's one of the most complex paradoxical teachings of Mahayana Buddha. And according to Nagarjuna, right, he's this Indian philosopher from the 2nd to 3rd century, all things that are compound, right, all compounded things. So even us, we are, you know, we're a compound. We're made up of cells. We're made up of stuff. All of these things, he says, come to be and pass away. They arise and pass away. And all events are dependent on other events. This is the teaching of dependent arising. Everything that arises, everything that is, depends on its arising on other things, including ourself. So nothing has an independent origin, and there is no external reality. And so therefore samsara, this cycle of change, is really empty, he would say, of inherent existence. It is a fleeting dust in the wind. You know, everything that exists perishes. So ultimately there's this emptiness. Nirvana itself is empty in a sense. It is a thought construct, even though it's not dependent on any conditions. This is the passage in your book about sunyata, so I'll read this to maybe help elaborate a little bit more. In the Perfection of Wisdom scriptures, a student who has received lengthy teachings on sunyata is asked whether he understood them. The student declares, in truth, nothing has been taught. Everything being empty, there is nothing to cling to. So one who realizes emptiness is free to experience reality directly and be compassionate without attachment. The concepts of selflessness and emptiness help practitioners understand things as they are, and also help them overcome attachment to things, including attachment to concepts. And then she quotes from Professor Ruben Habito. One is able to celebrate every moment, every act, every thought, every sensation as expressive of a dynamic, unobjectifiable, unfathomable, indescribable realm that for lack of words we call emptiness, sunyata. To experience each moment in this world of form as a manifestation of sunyata is likewise to experience the world in the light of compassion. Having been freed of the notion of self as a subject in here, grasping objects out there, one is freed of this notion of self as separate from other selves. And this to me is something that I find very difficult to wrap my mind around. I kind of, it's not even the nothingness part. I get that. I get being able to lose yourself. I get being able to sort of detach yourself. I don't think that's as mystical as it sounds, as some of this textbook makes it sound. It's just, you know, sometimes you could just be sitting in the park on a nice sunny day and you're just having a really wonderful time and you're not even really aware. You're just like in this sort of zen-like state. There's no out there. You're not separate from anything, right? You're at one and at peace with the world. I get that. But when you're compassionate, that's a good thing, but it seems like when you're compassionate about something that you're attached. So it seems like, you know, that like the Buddha is asking you to be like a zombie that doesn't care about anything, but then you have to be compassionate. It almost seems like a mixed message. And no matter how many times I've had it explained to me, you know, and they understand how contradictory that it is, you know, it's sort of like you let go of yourself and then you care about others. And I get acting selflessly. I understand that, but still it seems like there's this, you you know, you get a good feeling in your heart when you help other people. And to me, that seems like a form of attachment. You know, you're like, I don't know. It seems like it defeats the purpose. If you're supposed to like not even get any joy out of it, you're just supposed to like do it because it's the right thing to do. It seems kind of like a contradictory thing. You know, it's like the Bodhisattva. If he's already been enlightened, why does he still care about the people in the building? Again, it's like, oh, he's not burning. He doesn't feel the the urges, but he still feels compassion for the others. And to me, it seems like, well, then he's still attached to helping others. I don't know. Maybe I'm rambling on too much about this and confusing you more than you already are, especially if this is the first time you're learning about all this stuff. But anyway, the texts that celebrate this experience of emptiness are usually the most foundational. They're kind of the most fundamental ones for the Mahayana Buddhists. The Heart Sutra is one of these, okay? And the popular Heart Sutra that is used liturgically throughout East Asia, the core doctrines of traditional Buddhism are systematically shattered. What does liturgical mean? Does anybody know that word, liturgical? They're used liturgically. What does that mean?
Not familiar.
You hear it in Christianity, a liturgy. It's just your ritual, right? So if you go to church, the liturgy would be, I guess, the procession, the prayer, the sermon. That's the liturgy, right? You know, and all that stuff. Catholicism, Mass, and all that. That's part of the liturgy. So the Heart Sutra is actually used in the liturgy. So priest will recite it, usually at the beginning of a meditation session, or maybe at the beginning of a Dharma talk or something like that. You'll often hear them recite passages from the Heart Sutra. So again, it's used throughout East Asia. Liturgically, the core doctrines of Buddhism are shattered in it, though, right? So it kind of goes against some of the doctrines, or at least on the face of it. The Bodhisattva Guanyin sees that the 5 aggregates of a person, which are form, sensation, perception, karmic formations, and consciousness, are empty of absolute self-nature. They only exist relative to other aggregates. Now, I don't know if that's really anathema to Buddhist teachings that are early on. We already talked about the Buddha teaching of An-Atman. Who remembers what that one is? Remember Atman from Hinduism? That's the true self. The Buddha believes in An-Atman. So what's An-Atman?
The opposite.
Yeah, so there's a true self in Hinduism. Is there that such a thing in Buddhism? Is there a self to the Buddha? Is that even a thing? Do you have a self?
Yes.
Nope. 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 You're far off the path, Stephanie. You gotta let go of that self, right? Sorry. Yeah. No. You've got. There's no self. As I quoted here. All this, everything exists relative to other aggregates. So your sense of identity, the only reason you think that there is a Stephanie is because your parents gave you a name, or whoever raised you, they gave you a name, and you have a place where you live, a city, and you go to a school, and all these things give you a sense of who you are. You have hobbies, you maybe have interests. If none of that existed, if you had nothing to hang on to, you'd have no sense of a self. And all that stuff I just mentioned is none of it's permanent. All of it's changing. It's always in a state of flux. So there's no permanent self. There's no permanent self. And so you have to let go of all that, I guess is the idea, right? You have to let go of, this sense of, this ego that you have. So we're all empty of absolute self-nature. We exist only relative to other aggregates. With this realization, the Bodhisattva becomes free of delusion. Next, birth and death, purity and defilement, increase and decrease are seen as empty. The 6 sense objects, the 6 sense organs, and the 6 sense awarenesses are seen as empty. Life and death are seen as empty. The 4 Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path are seen as empty. Even knowledge and attainment are proclaimed to be empty. With this perfection of wisdom, there are no obstacles and no fear. Having seen through the illusion of true existence, even the ultimate existence of the core Buddhist teachings, one attains nirvana. So this is one that I think some lazy Buddhists try to use. In one of those readings I gave you, I think it's in one of the shorter discourses on D2L. There's a story of how someone uses the raft to get to the island, and so the bhiksu, I think the nun, the monk, he needs the raft, which is the teachings, the vehicle that helps him to get to nirvana, the island. But once he gets to the island, he no longer needs the raft. He can throw the raft away. So the idea is that once you get to nirvana, you no longer need the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and all this stuff. And so some lazy Buddhist will say, oh, I achieved enlightenment, so that means I can do attachment, I can be lazy, I can get drunk, I can, because I don't have to follow the Eightfold Path. But I really don't think that's what that passage is trying to say. I think what it's saying is that these are tools, these are guides towards letting go, towards enlightenment. Once you achieve enlightenment, you've already used the tools and you're just enlightened and you're at one with everything. So there's no need to think about, am I following it? You just do it. You just do it. It's sort of like, reminds me of a passage from Paul where I forget, I think it's the letter to the Romans, and he says something like, you will know us by our actions. They say, how do you know that someone is a true Christian? And he says, you will know by their deeds, or something like this. So in other words, a real Christian, if you really found Christ and you really, really repented, you will act good. You will not sin. You will be a good person who helps others and cares for the poor and cares for the sick. And if you don't do that, then you didn't really find enlightenment. So I think the idea, like some Buddhists are like, well, I'm getting drunk because I already got to the island. I don't need to follow the Eightfold Path. No. That's not what that passage meant. It meant that, kind of like what Paul was saying, is like once you find the truth, you embody it in your actions, I think is the idea. And so you don't need to attach yourself to like, did I read enough of the sutras today? Did I read that passage right? No, you've already figured that all out. You've come to this realization, this enlightenment, and you're at one and you're at peace. And you achieve this emptiness, right? A lot of times when you see the word nothing in a Buddhist scripture, it will be hyphenated. And I kind of prefer that because, no hyphen thing, no thing. So it's not that there isn't, if you achieve this state, it's not that nothing exists. It's that there aren't these individual things. I'm not separate from this desk. I'm not separate from this bottle. I'm not separate from my computer. I'm not separate from you and from either of you or anything else in the universe. There are no things. There's no me and the world outside. There's just this one. So that's this nothingness. It's a no thingness. In that sort of a sense, if that helps at all. That might even make it more confusing. So I should probably just move on. We're gonna get to Zen. We're gonna get to Zen Buddhism. Did you have a comment or question? Or?
Yeah, I had a comment. So you get to this level of enlightenment, but once you get there, like, do they believe that now you can achieve being yourself, or does that mean that you would still have to follow, like you're still nobody at all?
This is something that is I would say a point of debate amongst the schools, and even within the schools. Like you're gonna see in Zen, even some Zen schools, I always forget which one, whether it's the Rinzai or the Soto, I always forget which one believes what. But some schools think that when you achieve enlightenment, you always have it, that it's just on. Like you are in nirvana, you're like in a state of enlightened peace every moment of the day. And so everywhere you walk, everything you say, like you may seem like you're there as an individual, but you're in this enlightened state forever. But whereas others say, no, it's something you're able to tap into, but you have to come back to reality, or you have to come back to quote unquote reality, what we think is reality. And, so So yeah, it's, some will say it's something you sort of achieve and then kind of come back, and then others are like, no, once you get to this level of consciousness, you're just that way. It's like a permanent state that you're in. So at least the way I understand it, I'm kind of with the first, like, or the second, or the first actually. It's occasional, it's like, it just seems
Mhm.
to me like in the society we live in, unless you live in a monastery and you're allowed to just meditate all day and you don't have to worry about anything, it seems like there's too many modern distractions for you to always be in a Zen-like state. But maybe that's my Western mind, and my bias.
Yeah, because if you would get to a certain level of enlightenment and you stayed there throughout, then what would be the purpose
I, I
continuing, you know, because the whole reason is to get there to that enlightenment. So if you once you get there and there's no going back, then what would be the reason of continuing the tradition?
Right. And that's what really kind of always confused me about the notion of the bodhisattva is like, well, if they've achieved enlightenment, then that means they've become completely detached and they don't have any like concern. And it seems like
Mhm.
compassion, as good as it is to be compassionate, it seems like a form of attachment. So it seems like if you're attached, but it's supposed to be this detached compassion. I don't know how that works, but I guess it works somehow. It's
Mhm.
like, you care but you don't care. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I don't know how it works, but it's a good question. It's definitely a good question, and it's one that I'm sure they get a lot, because you'll see it in some literature. If you visit a Buddhist temple, you might see that, like, we don't want you to be a zombie. That's not what we're saying. It's just that, um, don't do these things out of, try not to do these things, like don't do charity out of a sense just so you can pat yourself on the back. Just do it out of a sense of selflessness. But to me that seems like kind of a hard thing to do. But maybe it's
Yeah.
because maybe I've got too big of an ego and I need to, like, lower that. I don't know. So anyway, well, let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about Zen, Pure Land Buddhism, Nichiren Buddhism, and Tibetan Buddhism. How are we doing for time? Let's see. I got 30 minutes to go, so I think we can do this. I got a lot to say about Zen, not a whole lot to say about Pure Land, and not a lot to say about the other two either, right? So the textbook doesn't say much either. I've studied Zen myself on my own and other classes, when I was undergraduate. So I've added a little bit of information to sort of fill in some of the textbook, but really not a lot there. So I mean, again, this will be pretty quick, I think. So let me get back to my notes here, make sure I don't miss anything uh, essential. So Zen, some refer to this as the Great Way of Enlightenment. This is, some say, the kind of a more eccentric path, even though it's probably the more famous school outside of China and Japan. People, when they think of Buddhism, they'll typically think of Zen. There's Bodhidharma. He's considered the founder of Zen. And again, we mentioned King Oshaka at the beginning. When Zen starts to be transmitted from India to China around the 1st century, you get all these monks who start to spread it, towards Korea, all the way to Japan, Vietnam, and along the way, it absorbs elements of Taoism. So we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to Taoism. But they think that Shan Buddhism, which originally was, in China called Shan, Chan, then migrates to Japan, now known as Zen, Zen. But they think that this started, it can be traced back to around the 5th century, so 400s. There's an Indian monk, this man Bodhidharma. He traveled to a monastery apparently in China, and he spent 9 years in meditation just staring at a wall. And after this experience, he became recognized as the first patriarch of Zen, okay, of this radical path known as actually Chan. That was the original, the Chinese Zen. And that comes from the Sanskrit word dhyana, which means meditation. Um, so the idea here is that the teachings are transmitted from master to disciple without any scripture that's necessary. So it's a direct translation of enlightened energy or enlightened teaching. There's no dependence on the authority of words or letters. And there's sort of a direct pointing of the soul, a direct pointing to the soul of human nature, right? What are we? How are we? What are we like? And how do we escape that? And trying to see into our own nature and see ourselves as the Buddha, right? See the Buddha within ourselves, right? Try to achieve Buddhahood through this meditative and inward glancing path, this meditative path. So again, Bodhidharma was considered this monk who started the school. He traveled all the way to to China from India, spent 9 years staring at the wall. And he's, many scholars think he's just made up. He's not factual. He's just some sort of mythical figure who might be a composite of actual people who came together to, devise this practice. But when this school was eventually transmitted to Japan, it became known as Zen. And Zen, you'll hear this from a lot of different faiths, but Zen claims to preserve the essence of the Buddha's teaching through direct experience. So they're going to say that many other forms of Buddhism have become adulterated, that they're not pure, and that Zen preserves the direct teaching that was passed on from disciple to teacher to disciple to teacher, and on, all the way back. So this mind-to-mind transmission of Dharma. There are these two schools of Zen. These aren't in the textbook, so this is sort of extra information here. There's Rinzai, which is the recognition model, and Soto. So these are the two major schools of Zen. Again, the recognition model, that's the Rinzai. The idea is to see the nature within yourself, to become the Buddha through seeing the nature within you. You achieve Satori, that's their term for enlightenment or release, using koans. Okay, so a koan is, it's a saying or a question that is supposed to help to guide you towards enlightenment. And I'll give you a few examples here in a second, but let's talk a little bit more about Soto. So the Soto believes that the Buddha nature, that's basically synonymous with the term enlightenment. To achieve enlightenment is to find one's Buddha nature, and they think that the Buddha nature is always within you. It's there. In fact, maybe even you had it when you were a baby. It's when you get older and you start to develop an identity and a sense of self that you start to lose the Buddha nature. So you almost want to become a child again, become childlike, become the baby, right? Unlearn, deprogram all that stuff. So the Buddha nature is already there. Just let go of all your worldly attachments. Just sit and allow it to emerge. So just some terminology I have here. I mentioned koans before. I'll give you some examples of those in just a second. But what's Kinsho? Kinsho is considered a sudden burst of enlightenment or insight. We already talked about the arguments, whether like enlightenment is something you can permanently maintain, if you maintain a state of enlightenment, or if it's something that's a flash. Again, that's a debate within Zen. Since we already sort of talked about it, I'll skip over a lot of that stuff. The term zazen there that I have written down, that is the term for sitting, literally means sitting meditation. Zazen is to sit and to meditate. Satori, again, path of enlightenment. And again, a typical meditative tool that is used in Zen practice is the koan. And there are some famous examples, like what is the sound of one hand clapping? Does the dog have a Buddha nature? If a tree falls in the woods and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? What was your face before you were born? Or what did your face look like before you were born? Just kind of absurd questions that you're supposed to take serious and think about the actual answer to them. And through your confusion, you're trying to let go, I suppose, and achieve this state of, sunyata or satori, this enlightenment, this letting go. But there's this long passage from the textbook that I want to read that gives a general description of meditative practice. Like I said earlier, a lot of these descriptions make it sound the same. All of these schools will insist that they have their own way of meditating, that they teach meditation differently. But from my experience, the differences are very superficial, and most of it's pretty much the same. It has a lot to do with breathing, mindfulness, concentration. But let's go ahead and read here and see what the textbook has to say about Zazen. So instructions in the manner of sitting are quite rigorous. one must maintain an upright posture. That's true, though. They do have a very, got to sit in the lotus position, crossing your legs. Don't move during meditation. Avoid distracting the mind. Skillful means are then applied to make the mind one-pointed and clear. One beginning practice is simply to watch and count each inhalation and exhalation from 1 to 10, starting over from 1 if anything other than awareness of breath enters the mind. Although this practice sounds simple, the mind is so restless that many people must work for months before finally getting to 10 without having to start over. And I can attest to that. It's definitely true. Getting to 10 is not really the goal. The goal is the process itself, the process of recognizing what comes up in the mind and gently letting it go without attachment or preferences. As one practices Zazen, undisturbed by phenomena, one becomes inwardly calm, and the natural mind is revealed in its original purity. This original mind is spacious and free, like an open sky. Thoughts and sensations may float through it like clouds, but they arise and then disappear, leaving no trace. What remains is insight into thusness, the true nature of things. In some Zen schools, this perception of thusness comes in a sudden burst of insight or kensho. Did someone have a comment? I just heard a peep
No,
out.
sorry, that was somebody
All right.
walking in.
Okay, so again, let me make sure there's okay. Oh, I have another quote on the koan. To concentrate on a koan, one must look closely at it without thinking about it, experience it directly beyond abstractions. Roshi Kapleau explains the import of every koan is the same, that the world is one interdependent whole, and that each separate one of us is that whole. Okay, so again, the aim of Zen practice should be obvious by now. It's sort of enlightenment, release of the cycle of samsara, and this is often experienced as a flash of insight known as satori. There's that term again. You directly experience the interrelatedness of all existence, right? So again, this experience of enlightenment known as satori, it's an experience of the interrelatedness of all things, a recognition that nothing is separate from yourself. All aspects of life are utterly precious, and at the same time utterly empty. Nothing is special, and all is one. Right. So this paradox, apparently, it's like a paradox that, and maybe this is the problem with us, right? Sorry, is it Estefania? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I think that's a problem, that we can't understand it because we're trying to understand it. It's not to be understood by the rational mind. If you try to put it into rational terms, you don't get it. It's just let it go, okay? And that might seem like a cop-out. I know a lot of philosophers, like philosophy majors, people who are philosophers. Hey, you can't give a reason and you can't explain it, then it's just bullshit, right? It's not a good argument. But to that I say, okay, I get that. I don't expect you to believe it, but doesn't mean it's not true, right? I mean, if you want to say, I love my mom more than I love pizza, then I'll believe you. I believe you. But could I measure it? Could you measure it? Could you put a number on it? Could you prove it? How could you prove it? So there might be things that are true that can't be rationalized, that can't be put into terms, that are just black and white, that are just, able to be put on some grid or some chart. So I guess that's the idea, is that this truth is one of those kind of truths that you have to sort of let go of any way of answering it, and then it'll make sense somehow, right? How nothingness can be whole,
Yeah, I think that we look at it too technical
Right.
to really understand what they mean and how they resonate with it.
Exactly, right. So, when we get to these other forms of Buddhism, especially the Nichiren and the Pure Land Buddhists, you're gonna see it's quite different. It's almost like I mean, I hate to oversimplify it. I'm hesitant to compare these religions, even though it's a class in comparative religions, because I feel like a lot of people get offended by that. They're like, well, I'm a Buddhist. Yeah. How dare you compare me to a Hindu? And it's like, well, come on. But I haven't, to me, the Pure Land schools are very much like Christianity, because they see the bodhisattvas as saviors. Okay, so the idea is that there's no way that we can be saved. Okay, the world is way too corrupt, it's too greedy, it's too full of temptations. But luckily, there are these enlightened beings. Like here's one of them, Amida Buddha, right? This is the Pure Land school who will they will devote their practice to honoring the Amida Buddha because they believe that Amida was able to achieve enlightenment in an earlier time before things got really bad. And out of his compassion, because he loves all of us so much, he prepared the Pure Land. And so the Pure Land is this really wonderful place, like heaven, I guess you could say, right? Everything's perfect and there's no temptations and there's no corruption. And so if you spend your life being really nice and devotional towards Amida and telling him how great he is and how thankful you are for all he's done for you and praying to him, then when you die, you will be reborn in this pure land. And then when you're in the pure land, then you can meditate and then you can achieve enlightenment and then you can get out of the cycle of death and birth and rebirth and all this stuff. Okay, so this school actually, although it's not as well known to Westerners, if you tell people about like Pure Land Buddhism and other forms like this, they'll be like, what's that? They've heard of Zen, but this is the much more popular one. This is the one that most, you know, and I was talking about the Vietnamese Buddhist Center. They're Mahayana, but they devote to Wan Yin. Okay, so they're kind of they're not Pure Land. They wouldn't call themselves that. I'm not sure what they would, if they even label themselves. A lot of these labels are kind of labels that Westerners have kind of given them. Not all of them were like self-named. So, but they're very similar. Many popular forms of Buddhism, like if you know people, like most of my students who are Buddhist, who go to Buddhist temples, their parents are Buddhist and they were raised Buddhist, you know, maybe like their parents were immigrants and they're first or second generation. This is the type, again, it might not be Pure Land, they might not be devoting to Amida, but it'll look something like this. They'll go to a temple, they'll chant, Amida, 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 I love you, I love you, I love you. I mean, not in English, like in Vietnamese or Chinese or whatever, but like the same word over and over and over again. Amida, 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 you're great, you're great, you're great, you're great, we love you, 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 Amida, Amida. Like they'll just say it for hours, like an hour, and I guess it puts you in a trance. And it makes you lose yourself. It makes you lose a sense of where you're at, or, you know, so it's sort of like a more popular form of, like, lack of a better word, meditation, and becoming, you know, letting go of yourself and devoting yourself to Amida. But I haven't even looked at my notes yet for Pure Land. So I feel like I've said everything. Let me make sure I haven't skipped. We could probably move on to Nishi Ren, but let me look. Oh, there's some more slides there showing that's a statue of Amida. It looks bronze. So like I said, this has much more popular appeal than the Zen. Yeah, and Amida was supposed to be some ancient prince, so they think he was royalty. He lived, they think, around the 13th century, so 1200 is around the time they think he actually lived. And he, you know, just like the real Buddha, he left his married life and became this monk and achieved, you know, enlightenment. So I think the term Amida Buddha means Buddha. I thought I had it in my notes here, but oh, there it is. It means Buddha of boundless light. So he shines boundless light on all, right? He gives us hope for this pure land. In fact, I think the next slide I actually have a quote. Yeah, there it is. There's a quote that talks about the pure land. The monk Genshin. Oh wait, I didn't mean to do that. Let me back up. The monk Genshin described the ineffable pleasures of being reborn into the pure land upon death. Rings, bracelets, a crown of jewels, and other ornaments in countless profusion adorn his body. And when he looks upon the light radiating from the Buddha, he obtains pure vision. And because of his experience of former lives, he hears the sounds of all things. And no matter what color he may see or what sound he may hear, it is a thing of marvel. right? So kind of similar to, you know, some of the wording you get from the Bible in Revelations about streets paved with gold. I mean, it's not exactly the same, but, you know, the similar kind of, you know, and I think that it's supposed to be understood metaphorically here too, right? But anyways, let me make sure I have said all I want to say about Pure Land, and then we'll move on to Nichiren. Um, okay, so some think that the Pure Land is life as after death, but there are a few that think it's just a metaphor. It's a metaphor for the experience of enlightenment in everyday life. It's just an expanded state of consciousness. So it depends on who you ask. But if you look at that documentary, not the one I mentioned earlier, there's actually two Buddha documentaries. There's one called Footsteps of the Buddha, and I think the other one's called The Land of the Disappearing Buddha. That second one, The Land of the Disappearing Buddha, they go visit a Pure Land temple in Japan, and they talk to some of the practitioners, and they seem to think of it as the afterlife. They're like, oh, you'll go to this big, pretty place when you die, and everyone will go there eventually. No matter how bad you are, you'll get a chance. You know, you'll be reborn, and all will be saved thanks to Amida Buddha. Okay, so
What was it called? The second one, Land of the Disappearing Buddha, right?
that documentary, yeah, the land
Okay,
of
yeah,
the
yeah.
land of, yeah,
Okay.
the land of the disappearing Buddha.
Hey, can you find it on YouTube or?
I think so. That's where I found it. I put the link to it on the website. And if you scroll down in Unit 1, there's like a section that says like optional documentaries. It should be there. So.
Okay.
I actually think that one's the better of the two. There's two Buddha documentaries, and to me that's, I guess because I'm more interested in Zen and has a lot of stuff about Zen, so maybe I'm biased, but I think it's more interesting of the two. You know, the first one covers more like the Theravada Buddhist, and it's all in Sri Lanka. But the second one does Mahayana. Okay, so let's talk a bit about just a little bit about Nichiren. This one is another very popular. They actually have ministries where they'll go around and spread Buddhism throughout the world. You'll find some Nichiren temples and stuff, you know, here in Houston, and they look for recruits, and they even have, sometimes they'll have like Nichiren organizations on campus, just like they'll have like, you know, the college Baptists, they'll have like the college Buddhists, and they're almost always Nichiren. Almost always, you know, they'll be Nichiren. So Nichiren was the founder, okay? He was, you know, was a real person. We do know he was real. You know, how much of these stories about him are true, that's debatable, but he lived in the 13th century, so around the same time that they believe that the Amida guy lived, right? The real prince that became the Amida Buddha. But so Nichiren was apparently a fisherman's son who studied all the Buddhist texts, and he realized that the Lotus Sutra was the highest one. He felt like the Lotus Sutra, which we mentioned earlier, was kind of embodied all truth. It was all you really needed. You could unlock all the highest truths of Buddhism through the Lotus Sutra. So he gave this big emphasis on it within Nichiren practice. I thought I got, but I guess I didn't. There's a couple bodhisattvas in Nichiren that are important. There's the bodhisattva of superb action and the bodhisattva ever abused. They're mentioned in your textbook, right? So the bodhisattva of superb action is devoted to spreading truth, and the bodhisattva ever abused, this kind of ties into Nichiren himself because he was persecuted, but the bodhisattva ever abused is this like persecuted, you know, bodhisattva who always has to take the blame and always has to like be, you know, dishonored by the authorities, for his reverence of everybody, because he loved everybody. He goes around saying, you're the Buddha, you're the Buddha, you're the Buddha, because everyone's the Buddha. And so he's kind of ridiculed, and he's ever abused, okay? Because he has this conviction that everybody potentially has the Buddha nature within them. So again, I mentioned that Nichiren himself was very unpopular with the authorities because of his efforts to reform some of the popular forms of Buddhism in Japan. And so he's known, like his followers, they're much like the Pure Land. They're known for chanting. They do a lot of chants in their practice. There's a big emphasis there in Nichiren on world peace. In fact, these are temples are called peace pagodas. They, they want to spread this. Remember, Mahayana Buddhism in general is the path of wisdom and compassion. So the big focus here is on spreading peace and understanding throughout the world, and a respect for all human beings. And so the Bodhisattva loves all living beings as if each were his own child, right? That's the idea. So here are just a few pictures. I just did a quick Google search trying to find Nichiren peace pagodas. But again, a lot of the practice of Nichiren has to do with chanting, right? Chanting is a form of, I guess, what Christians might think of as prayer or devotion. They do chants, not just to the Bodhisattvas, but they'll chant and recite passages from the Lotus Sutra. So remember, the Lotus Sutra is a key text to the Nichiren practitioner. I'm sorry, but that's about all I have to say about Nichiren. I know that's not much, but it's about all I know. Now, when we get to the Tibetan Buddhist, this is another one that, if you're a Westerner, like if you live in California and you're like some hippie like my parents were, and you're like, oh yeah, Buddha, yeah, you probably you're thinking of Zen or you're thinking of Tibetan Buddhism typically. I find though that as much as Westerners misunderstand Buddhism, they misunderstand Tibetan the worst, because they don't realize Tibetan Buddhism is pretty, and I don't understand it a lot, but it's I've done at least a little bit of reading into it. I've got some books back here on my shelf devoted to all the different deities in Tibetan Buddhism. But from my reading of it, it comes off very supernatural. There's all these different deities, all these different spirits. I mean, they might be called bodhisattvas, but they seem to actually believe in these spirits, and that you can get to enlightenment through these kind of intense practices of meditation, not just your normal sitting practices, but through really intense physical deprivation, or it's often called the diamond path. So this Theravada is the path of the elders, sometimes called the smaller path. That's not really, it's kind of derogatory. Then the Mahayana is the great vehicle, and Vajrayana, that's the Tibetan, is the diamond path, right? So the intense path. Now, Songtsen was this ruler of Tibet. Let me look at my notes here, because I'm not sure the dates here. I think it's 7th century is around the time he was living, so the 600s. And according to the stories, right, according to legend, according to what we know, it seems like he was interested in Buddhism and he wanted to learn about it. And he sends a mission to India, to this really mountainous region, to bring back the Buddhist teachings that he's heard so much about. And apparently only one survived, because it was a very difficult journey. So it was miraculous that, I think 20 monks tried to come and only one made it to Tibet. And Songtsen loved it. He loved the religion when he received the teachings, and he made it the national religion of Tibet. Now, many of these deities, in fact, I don't think I have pictures of them. Darn it. Yeah, I do at the end. They're at the end. So I guess we'll come back and we'll see a few pictures at the end. When I teach this class in person, I usually I have a huge book. It's a huge hardcover book that's got pictures of all these deities. So I just bring it with me and I pass it around the class. So that's why I don't have any pictures, or don't have that many pictures here. But a lot of these deities were thought to have been sort of integrated into Buddhism, into Tibetan Buddhism. They were already a part of an indigenous religion in Tibet that is no longer in existence, called Bon, B-O-N, but with the O has the umlaut, the two dots on top of it. So it's like a burn sound, I think is how you say it, burn, almost like burn, but like you're messing it up. But again, some people think that, some scholars, historians, people who study this, they think that a lot of the demons, deities, or whatever spirits that are in the Tibetan tradition are, some people think that about, when you look to Catholicism in South and Central America, that when all the missionaries were coming in, that some of the saints, Saint Guadalupe and all this stuff, they were like old spirits of some of the pagan, all the indigenous people. And some of the missionaries just sort of oh yeah, that's Saint so-and-so. Oh, that's, You know, they would just sort of like integrate it. And similar thing is thought to have happened with this indigenous religion of Tibet and Buddhism as it enters into this region. So I've got some pictures here of Tibetan prayer flags, right? That's a part of Tibetan Buddhist practice. These are, you know, I'm not really sure the significance of them, why they would be hung. I think that they're, you know, maybe the different colors stand for different things. Or they're supposed to designate like a holy site or something, but every time I see them, they just seem to be hung up intermittently, right? All these images that I have, they're just sort of set up in mountainsides or in an open field, etc. But the path itself, right? The path to enlightenment is supposed to be pretty complicated. It's this really complex, intense path towards enlightenment, and there are 3 stages that are involved. The first one doesn't seem very unique to Tibetan Buddhism. It just involves this quieting of the mind, this relinquishing of attachments. The second one, that seems just typical for Mahayana Buddhism, training in compassion and wisdom. But then the third, this is something I guess new, this is the diamond vehicle, the esoteric. Esoteric meaning not known by many people, only known by a few. This is the esoteric path, right? Vajrayana or Tantrayana. This is a rigorous, accelerated path used to nurture enlightenment within one lifetime, right? To kind of speed it up. So those who follow this path are supposed to be guided by lamas, the Lamas, that's one of the texts. So a lama, you may have heard of the Dalai Lama. He's the current lama. He's the spiritual leader of the tradition, and he's the one who's supposed to be able to guide practitioners on this path. See, those that want to follow this path, again, they're also guided by deity yoga. So we talked about all those 4 types of yoga in Hinduism. They add an extra type of yoga in Vajrayana. It's the deity yoga. So here's the pictures. I got some deities, right? Tibetan Buddhist deities here, pictures of them. Some of them look pretty darn scary. Some of them look just pretty typical. Some of them look a lot like the Hindu deities. But here, let's read this passage. This is what the textbook says about the deity yoga. Vajrayana, that's the Tibetan form, right? So Vajrayana initiates practice deity yoga, meditating on themselves in the form of a Buddha or a Bodhisattva in order to embody the enlightened qualities that the practitioner wishes to manifest. These radiant forms are themselves imagined and therefore lacking true existence, but meditating on them is considered a way to understand one's own true nature. Some of these meditational deities are shown in wrathful form, such as Mahakala, defender of Dharma, while others, such as Amitabha, are shown in peaceful form. Again, so I have a whole book of these here at home, right? This huge textbook with all these pictures. But, you know, so you're supposed to meditate and imagine yourself as being one of these, you know, deities and embodying the qualities, the good qualities that they have, okay? And you can look at images of them to sort of help and assist you in this practice. Another thing that's a part of Buddhist meditative practice in the Tibetan school is the use of mandalas. So the mandalas are these, I don't know what you would call them, pictures, paintings of these intricate patterns that you stare at, and they're very hard. See, you see these monks making them. They're making them with these very, very small grains, these beads that they slowly drop, and it takes them days to make these things. They pour them out very slowly and very patiently. If you ever watched that show, House of Cards, on Netflix, I think it was the 3rd season of House of Cards. They had these Buddhist monks at the White House. It's a show about the president, and it's kind of, he's all corrupt and all this stuff. But anyway, there's an episode or two, I think it's in season 3, where they have these Buddhist monks who are making a mandala in the White House, and they spend like 3 or 4 days just pouring it out. And then when they're done, they destroy it, right? They just completely destroy it. So it's supposed to be, you know, a good practice, you know, all that concentration, very tedious, makes you sort of lose yourself. And then you see the beautiful thing and you stare at all these patterns. Those patterns make you sort of lose yourself. And then you just float away. You destroy it, you know. These aren't to be destroyed, obviously. They look like they're tapestries and things that are permanent fixtures. But anyway, so I mentioned the Dalai Lama. I'm sure you probably heard of him. He's the last and maybe the final. This is kind of controversial. He's said this in interviews, whether he's not sure he'll have a predecessor or he'll be the last one. He seems to be kind of like, he doesn't want to give a straight answer about it, it seems. But, you know, currently he's in exile, right? So in 1950 to 1959, there was a big communist overrun of the entire country, and they destroyed many of the monasteries and killed millions of people, and he was forced to flee. You know, so he's still considered the spiritual leader of Tibet, but again, he's still in exile. He's been in exile since 1959, and who knows, again, what the future holds for Tibet. This is still a pretty controversial issue. So that's the end of the slide, and that is the end of Buddhism, I guess, for us. Does anybody, either of you, have anything else you want to add? Any questions or comments? Sorry, I guess I kept us a little longer. It's like 3 minutes over, but I felt like that was better than stopping and then doing a whole other video since we were so close to the end, you know? But if you got any comments, jump on in. Are you guys good to go, or you ready to knock out that Buddhism quiz and get an A+? Yeah,
for sure.
Okay, cool. All right, well, if there's nothing else, I guess I'll go ahead and stop it there.